The mountains didn't care what color you were. They killed you just the same. Private First Class Marcus Webb had learned that truth somewhere between Salerno and the Gothic Line, in the frozen mud and shattered stone of the Apennine Mountains, where winter came down like a fist and the Germans dug in like ticks. He'd learned it watching white officers send black soldiers up slopes they wouldn't climb themselves. Learned it in the segregated blood banks where his blood wasn't good enough to save a white man's life. Learned it in the cold mathematics of war where some lives were calculated differently than others. But none of that philosophy mattered much when you were crouched in a shell crater at 3 a.m, listening to the whistle of incoming 88s, watching the world explode in geysers of frozen earth and ancient rock. It was February 1945 and the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, though Marcus hated when white officers used that name with their mouths full of condescension, had been grinding through the mountains of northern Italy for what felt like a lifetime. The Gothic Line was supposed to have been broken months ago, but the Germans had other ideas, and the mountains had sided with them. Every ridge was a fortress. Every valley was a killing ground. Every village was a ghost town of shattered walls and the memory of people who had lived there before the war came and turned their homes into abbreviations on military maps. Marcus's company, Company C, 366th Infantry Regiment, had been moving north for 3 days through terrain that seemed designed by a malevolent god who hated soldiers specifically. The temperature hadn't climbed above freezing in a week. His boots were perpetually wet, his wool uniform perpetually inadequate, and his M1 Garand was the only thing he trusted completely in this world. Not the officers, not the supply lines, not the intelligence reports that were always optimistic and always wrong, but the rifle. The rifle didn't care about the color of his hands. They were approaching a village called Sommocolonia, a name that twisted Marcus's tongue when he tried to pronounce it, a cluster of stone buildings clinging to a mountainside like a widow to a coffin. The Germans had been there. Everyone knew that. The question was whether they were still there, and if they'd left anything behind besides mines and tripwires and the particular kind of silence that comes before an ambush. Lieutenant Morrison, their company commander, a white man from Virginia who'd grown up with black servants and thought that made him an expert on black soldiers, had called Marcus and 3 other squad leaders to a brief huddle behind a collapsed barn at the village's southern approach. Morrison's face was raw with cold, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, but his voice carried the particular confidence of men who'd never questioned their right to give orders. "Intelligence says the Krauts pulled out yesterday," Morrison said, unfolding a map that was more mud than paper. "Retreating toward the Po Valley. They're running, boys. We're going to walk right in, secure the village, and wait for the rest of the battalion to catch up." Sergeant James Jimmy Patterson, a farm boy from Alabama with hands like hammers and a mind sharp as cut glass, glanced at Marcus and then back at Morrison. "Sir, with respect, intelligence said that about Barga 2 weeks ago, and we walked into a company of SS who'd been there since Christmas." Morrison's jaw tightened. "You questioning the intelligence, Sergeant?" "No, sir. Questioning the Germans." "Well, don't. We move in 20 minutes. Webb, you take your squad up the east approach. Patterson, you're going in from the west. We'll converge in the square, assuming there is a square, and clear the buildings methodically. By the book." Questions? Marcus had about 1,000 questions, starting with why they were always the ones sent to test whether the intelligence was right, and ending with whether Morrison would be joining them or directing operations from the safety of this collapsed barn. But he kept his mouth shut. Questioning white officers was a luxury black soldiers couldn't afford, even when the questions might save lives. Especially then. "No questions, sir," Marcus said. Morrison nodded, satisfied with their silence, which he mistook for agreement. "Good. Move out in 20. And gentlemen, try not to shoot any civilians. The brass wants hearts and minds, not just real estate." As they dispersed back to their squads, Jimmy fell in beside Marcus, their breath fogging in the pre-dawn darkness. "You know, we're going to find something in there," Jimmy muttered. "The question is whether it's Germans or worse." "What's worse than Germans?" Marcus asked, though he knew the answer. They both did. What Germans leave behind? Marcus's squad consisted of 7 men, which meant they were 3 short of regulation strength, but 2 more than some units had after months of attrition. There was Private Willis, a kid from Detroit who'd lied about his age to enlist and still looked like he should be in a high school classroom rather than carrying a Browning automatic rifle through the Italian mountains. There was Corporal Thomas, a former Pullman porter from Chicago who'd seen more of America than most white folks and had the quiet dignity of men, who'd learned to survive in spaces that didn't want them. There was Private First Class Davis, who'd been a preacher's son in Mississippi and still carried a pocket Bible that had stopped a piece of shrapnel outside Lucca. though Davis insisted it was faith rather than physics that had saved him. Marcus gathered them in the lee of a stone wall that had probably stood for 500 years before the war came along and reminded everyone that nothing lasts forever. "Listen up," he said quietly. "We're going in from the east. Lieutenant says the Germans are gone, but we're going to move like they're waiting around every corner, because maybe they are. Willis, that bar is our insurance policy, so keep it ready, but keep it smart. Thomas, you're on point. Your eyes are better than mine. Davis, you're with me. We clear each building before we move to the next. We don't rush. We don't assume. We come home. Clear?" They nodded. These men who'd volunteered to fight for a country that fought them every day, who wore the uniform of a nation that wouldn't let them drink from the same water fountains as the people they were liberating. Marcus looked at their faces, young and old, scared and stoic, black as the Mississippi midnight, and felt the weight of responsibility that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the basic human obligation to keep your people alive. "All right, then," he said. "Let's go be heroes for people who'll never remember our names." They moved out as dawn began to leak into the eastern sky, turning the mountains from black to gray to a pale gold that would have been beautiful if it wasn't, illuminating potential killing fields. The village of Sommocolonia emerged from the gloom like a photograph, developing in reverse, first the outlines, then the details, then the realization that this had been a place where people had lived normal lives before. History decided to run a war through their living rooms. The buildings were typical of northern Italian mountain villages, stone and slate, narrow windows like suspicious eyes, streets barely wide enough for a cart. Everything built tight and defensive against winters that came down from the Alps like invading armies. But now there were gaps in the walls where artillery had punched through. Roofs collapsed into rubble, scorch marks where something had burned, and the silence. God, the silence was the worst part, because it wasn't really silence at all, but rather the absence of life. The held breath before something terrible happens. Thomas moved ahead, his rifle sweeping left and right with practiced economy, reading the terrain the way some men read newspapers. Marcus followed 10 feet back, maintaining the spacing that kept you alive when mortar came in. Behind him, Willis and Davis and the others spread out in a loose formation that would have made parade ground sergeants weep, but had been earned in actual combat where looking pretty got you killed. They were 50 yards into the village when Thomas raised his fist, the signal to stop. Everyone froze, became part of the landscape, that particular stillness that combat soldiers learn where you're simultaneously hyper-alert and barely breathing. Thomas pointed to a building ahead, a 3-story structure that might have been the mayor's house or the town hall, and then to his eyes. He'd seen something. Marcus crept forward, keeping to the shadows along the wall until he was close enough for Thomas to whisper. "Movement. 3rd floor. Could be a curtain, could be a person, could be a rifle," Marcus added. They watched for 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. Nothing moved. The window remained dark. But Marcus had learned to trust that instinct, that animal sense that told you when you were being watched. And right now, every nerve in his body was screaming that they weren't alone. "Cover me," Marcus said, and before Thomas could argue, he stepped into the street, not running, not creeping, but walking with deliberate visibility toward the building with the dark window. It was a calculated risk, the kind that either makes you look stupid or saves lives, and Marcus had made this gamble before. If there were Germans in that building, they'd already have shot at Thomas. Which meant whoever was watching wasn't German, which meant they were terrified, Americani. Marcus called out, his voice echoing off stone walls. "American soldiers. We're here to help." The silence that followed was different now, charged with decision and fear. Marcus stood in the street, completely exposed, trusting his life to the hope that whoever was behind that window could tell the difference between liberators and occupiers. Behind him, he knew his squad had their weapons trained on every window, every doorway, ready to light up the world if someone took a shot at their sergeant. "Non abiat pora," Marcus tried, mangling the Italian phrase he'd learned from a booklet the army had distributed and that most soldiers had used for toilet paper. "Don't be afraid." For a moment, nothing. Then the curtain in the 3rd-floor window twitched. Then slowly, hesitantly, it was pulled back, and Marcus saw a face-old female, deeply lined with worry and years, eyes wide with something between terror and desperate hope. Marcus raised his hand, palm out, the universal gesture of peace that had meant the same thing for 10,000 years. He smiled, though his heart was hammering. "Americani," he said again, softer. "We're the good guys. Promise." The old woman stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. Then she disappeared from the window. For a few seconds, Marcus wondered if he'd miscalculated, if she'd gone to get a weapon or alert others. But then he heard the sound of locks being drawn back, multiple locks. Heavy bolts. the kind of security that said these people had been living in fear for a very long time. The door opened 6 inches. The old woman's face appeared in the gap, and now Marcus could see she wasn't alone. Behind her, in the darkness of the entryway, there were others. Women, children, all of them staring at him with eyes that had seen too much. "Tedeschi?" the old woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Germans?" "They are gone?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am, gone. We're American soldiers. United States Army, we're here to—" He stopped because the woman had gasped. A sharp intake of breath that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with shock. She was staring at his face, his hands, his skin, and Marcus felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. He'd seen that look before: surprise, confusion, sometimes disgust from white soldiers who'd never seen black officers, from supply clerks who couldn't believe he could read and write, from nurses who'd rather let a black soldier bleed than touch his skin. But this woman's expression was different. Not disgust. Something else. Something Marcus couldn't quite read. "You are ... single quotes," she started, then stopped, searching for words in a language that wasn't hers. "You are Nero? Black?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said carefully. "I'm a black American soldier. So are most of my men. We're with the 366th Infantry Regiment. We're here to help." The woman turned and said something rapid in Italian to the people behind her. There was a moment of confused conversation, voices rising and falling, and then the door opened wider. Not all the way, but wider. And now Marcus could see them all, maybe 15 people, mostly women and children. A few elderly men, all of them pressed into the entryway of this building like refugees in their own town. "The Germans," the woman said, her English halting but determined. "They tell us ... They tell us the Americans are coming, but the Americans are ... monsters, beasts. They say the black soldiers will ... single quote." She stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "They say terrible things. They say we must hide, we must run, they will destroy everything." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest, but it wasn't surprise. Of course the Germans had said that. Of course they'd used the same poison that white supremacists had been using in America for centuries. The same lies that justified lynchings and segregation and every violence, large and small. Of course they'd tried to turn his skin into a weapon against him. "Ma'am," Marcus said quietly, "I can't tell you what to believe. But I can tell you what's true. We're here to push the Germans out. We're here to end the war. We're not here to hurt you or your children. We're just ... we're just soldiers. Human beings. Same as anyone." The woman studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus let her look. Let her see whatever she needed to see. Behind him, his squad waited with the patience of men who'd had to prove their humanity their entire lives. "You are not monsters," the woman said finally. It wasn't a question. It was a conclusion, reached despite everything she'd been told, based on nothing but the evidence of her eyes and the tone of his voice and maybe, Marcus hoped, some fundamental recognition of decency that propaganda couldn't fully poison. "No, ma'am," Marcus said. "We're not." The woman opened the door fully, and Marcus saw tears running down her weathered cheeks. She reached out. Marcus almost flinched, trained by years of American racism to expect a blow, but instead she took his hand in both of hers, gripping it with surprising strength. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for not being what they said you would be." And Marcus, who'd been trained not to show weakness, who'd learned in 100 hard lessons that tears were a luxury black soldiers couldn't afford, felt his throat tighten. Because this woman was thanking him for being human, for not being a monster, for clearing a bar so low it was buried in the ground, and yet it meant everything because someone had seen him and recognized what should have been obvious but never was. "You're welcome, ma'am," he managed. "Now we need to make sure the village is secure. Is there anyone else here? Any more civilians?" "Many," the woman said. "Many in the cellars, in the church, hiding. We hear the Germans leave in the night, but we are afraid. We think maybe it is a trick. We think maybe they wait to come back." "They're not coming back," Marcus said with more confidence than he felt. "But we need to check every building, make sure there are no soldiers hiding, no traps. Can you help us? Can you tell people it's safe?" The woman nodded and turned to speak to the others. The Italian came fast and musical, and Marcus caught maybe one word in 5, but he understood the meaning. They were spreading the word. The Americans had arrived. The black soldiers weren't monsters. Liberation had a face, and it looked different than they'd imagined, but it was real. Over the next hour, as the sun climbed higher and turned the mountains gold and the village began to exhale its held breath, something remarkable happened. People emerged. First in ones and twos, then in small groups, then in what seemed like an entire population that had been compressed into cellars and attics and the crypt of the village church. They came out blinking into the light, carrying children and bundles of possessions, looking around at their broken village as if seeing it for the first time. And they saw Marcus in his squad, saw Thomas carefully clearing a building, saw Willis standing guard with his BAR looking impossibly young and impossibly serious, saw Davis helping an elderly man navigate the rubble in the street, one hand supporting the man's elbow, moving with the gentle patience of someone who'd helped his own grandfather navigate the world long after age had made it treacherous. Marcus watched their faces as they processed the scene, watched the moment when expectation collided with reality, watched fear transform into confusion, and then slowly, tentatively into something that might have been relief or might have been the beginning of trust. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, with dark curls and eyes like coffee, broke away from her mother and approached Willis. Willis, who'd been maintaining a defensive position at the corner of the square, looked down at this tiny person approaching his enormous rifle with more courage than sense. "Chow," the girl said. "You are the American?" Willis glanced at Marcus, uncertain. Marcus nodded. "Yes," Willis said carefully. "I'm American." "My name is Willis. What's yours?" "Francesca," the girl said. She studied Willis with the frank curiosity of children who haven't yet learned to hide what they think. "You are black like chocolate, Francesca?" Her mother called out, horrified. "Scusa?" "I'm sorry," but Willis just laughed, a real laugh, the first Marcus had heard from any of them in days. "Yeah," Willis said to the girl, "I guess I am like chocolate. Dark chocolate, though, not milk chocolate. I like chocolate," Francesca announced with the solemnity of someone making an important declaration. Then, with no warning, she reached out and touched Willis's hand as if confirming he was real. Willis froze, and Marcus saw something flash across his face. A lifetime of white people treating black skin like a contamination. A threat. Something to be avoided or eliminated. But this child was touching him with simple curiosity, no hatred, no fear, just the desire to understand something new. "See," Francesca said to her mother, "he is nice. Not like the Germans said." The mother approached, wringing her hands. "I am sorry," she said to Willis, to Marcus, to all of them. "We are told ... The Germans, they tell us many things. Lies. All lies. You are ... single quotes," she struggled for words. "You are welcome here. You save us." Marcus felt Lieutenant Morrison's presence before he heard him. The officer had emerged from his command post now that the shooting hadn't started, now that the danger was assessed and catalogued and deemed acceptable. "Good work, Webb," Morrison said, surveying the scene. "Hearts and minds, just like I said. These people seem friendly enough." Marcus bit back his response. Friendly enough. As if these people owed them friendliness, as if liberation was a transaction that required gratitude as payment. But he just nodded. "Yes, sir. The villagers say the Germans pulled out last night, heading north toward the valley. They left in a hurry, didn't even take all their equipment." Morrison frowned. "Why would they leave equipment?" "Doesn't make tactical sense unless ... unless they're planning to come back," Jimmy Patterson said, joining them. His squad had cleared the western half of the village and found the same things: fear, relief, and buildings still standing, which was unusual enough to be suspicious. "Or unless they're setting up somewhere nearby," Marcus added, using the village as bait. "Let us relax, settle in, and then hit us when we're not expecting it." Morrison considered this, and Marcus could see the lieutenant's mind working through scenarios, calculating odds, trying to balance caution with the pressure from above to keep advancing, keep pushing, keep bleeding for real estate that might not matter in the grand scheme but mattered enormously to the colonels and generals whose names would go in history books. "Set up a perimeter," Morrison decided. "Willis, Thomas, you're on watch. I want eyes on all approaches. Webb, Patterson, get the civilians into the church. It's the most defensible building. If the Krauts come back, I don't want them using civilians as shields." They spent the rest of the day preparing for an attack that might or might not come, while the villagers watched these black American soldiers transform their home into a fortress. Marcus saw how they looked at his men, saw the surprise that never quite faded, the cognitive dissonance of people confronting propaganda with reality. But he also saw something else: recognition. These were farming people, mountain people, people who'd spent centuries being looked down on by northern Italians, by Romans, by anyone with power. They knew what it was like to be dismissed, to be considered less than. Maybe that's why they seemed to accept black liberators more readily than the brass had expected. As evening came and the temperature dropped and the mountains turned from gold to gray to black, Marcus found himself in the church with about 30 civilians. The church was small and old, built from the same gray stone as everything else, with walls 3 feet thick and narrow windows that had probably been designed more for defense than devotion. The villagers had brought what they could: blankets, food, a few precious possessions. The old woman who'd first opened the door, whose name Marcus had learned was Signora Bianchi, had taken charge of organizing everyone with the efficiency of someone who'd survived worse. Marcus's squad was positioned around the church, Thomas on the roof with binoculars, Willis at the main door with his bar, Davis making rounds, checking positions. Marcus himself was in the nave, trying to stay alert despite the exhaustion that came from 3 days of movement and the constant adrenaline of expecting combat. Signora Bianchi approached him with a bowl of something that steamed in the cold air. "You must eat," she said, offering it to him. "You are too thin. All you soldiers, too thin." Marcus took the bowl, some kind of soup or stew. Vegetables and maybe a little meat, smelling like rosemary and garlic and humanity. "Thank you, ma'am." "You don't have to, I have to," she interrupted. "You save us. The least I can do is feed you." She settled onto the pew beside him, moving with the careful deliberation of old joints and hard years. "You have a family? Wife? Children?" Marcus thought of Clara, his girl back in Philadelphia, who wrote him letters he could recite from memory and sent him photographs he kept in a waterproof pouch against his heart. "Someone back home," he said. "We're going to get married when I get back." "If I get back." "When," Signora Bianchi corrected firmly. "Not if. When. You must believe this." "Yes, ma'am." They sat in silence for a moment, Marcus eating the soup that tasted like the first real food he'd had in weeks. "Signora." Bianchi watching him with the frank assessment of someone who'd raised children and buried loved ones and survived occupation. "The Germans," she said finally, "they tell us that black soldiers are animals, not human. They say you will do terrible things, kill the men, hurt the women, take everything." She looked at him directly. "Why do they say this? Why do they work so hard to make us afraid of you?" Marcus set down the bowl and tried to find words that would make sense to this woman who'd lived her entire life in a mountain village and probably never seen a black person before today. "Because fear is a weapon," he said slowly. "And when people are afraid of you, they don't see you as human. They don't ask questions about why you're being treated a certain way. The Germans said those things because they wanted you to be more afraid of us than of them. They wanted you to think liberation would be worse than occupation. But why?" she pressed. "Why do they think we will believe this? You are just men, soldiers. Why should your skin make you monsters?" "Because that's what they've been taught," Marcus said. "The Germans, they've got their ideas about race, about who's superior and who's inferior. But it's not just them. Back in America, ... single quotes," he stopped, unsure how to explain Jim Crow and lynchings and separate water fountains to someone who'd never experienced it. "Back home, a lot of white people think the same way. They think black people are less than human, dangerous, threatening, so they make laws to keep us separate, keep us controlled. And when black soldiers put on uniforms and carry rifles, that threatens the whole system because suddenly we're equal or we're supposed to be. Can't be inferior if you're fighting and dying for the same country, right?" Signora Bianchi shook her head slowly. "This is why you fight? For a country that treats you this way?" "No, ma'am," Marcus said. "I fight because the alternative is worse. I fight because fascism has to be stopped. And if I don't fight it here, it'll come to Philadelphia eventually. I fight because maybe, just maybe, when this is all over and we've bled on enough foreign soil, America might finally decide we're human enough to treat like citizens. But mostly ... single quotes," he paused, searching for honesty. Mostly I fight for the men next to me, for Willis and Thomas and Davis and all the other black soldiers who can't go home until this is over. We fight for each other because nobody else is going to." The old woman reached out and patted his hand, the same gesture she'd probably used to comfort her own children, her grandchildren. "This is wrong," she said simply. "You should not have to prove you are human. This should be obvious." "It should be," Marcus agreed. "But here we are." The night passed in tense vigilance. The Germans didn't come back. Either they'd genuinely retreated or they were playing a longer game. At dawn, Marcus's squad was relieved by another unit, and they grabbed a few hours of sleep in what had been someone's home furniture still in place. Photographs still on the walls, lives interrupted mid-sentence by war. When Marcus woke, it was afternoon, and he found Francesca, the little girl who'd touched Willis's hand, sitting on a broken wall near where he'd collapsed. She was drawing something in the dirt with a stick, concentrating with the fierce focus of childhood. "Hey," Marcus said, sitting up and immediately regretting it as every muscle in his body filed a formal complaint. "What are you drawing?" Francesca looked up, unafraid. "Soldiers," she said, showing him the stick figures she'd scratched into the dust. "The American soldiers who save us, see? This is the big one with the big gun," she pointed to what was presumably Willis. "And this is you. You were the one who came first." who was not afraid. Marcus studied the crude drawing, these stick figures that represented him and his squad, and felt something twist in his chest. "That's good," he said. "Really good. You're a talented artist. My mama says I must remember you," Francesca said seriously. "All of you. She says the black soldiers save our village, and I must tell my children someday. I must remember that the Germans lied, that you were good." "We're just soldiers," Marcus said, but the words felt inadequate. "We're just doing our job." "No," Francesca insisted with the certainty of the young. "You are heroes, and you are black, both things. My mama says this is important. The Germans say black people are bad, but you are good. So the Germans are liars about everything," out of the mouths of babes, Marcus thought. This 6-year-old had distilled in one observation what it had taken him years to understand, that proving your humanity to people who'd been taught to deny it was a form of resistance, a victory over propaganda that might matter more than any hill taken or town secured. Over the next few days, as the front lines moved north and Sommocolonia became a rear area supply point, Marcus watched his men interact with the villagers, watched Willis teach Francesca how to count to 10 in English, watched Thomas help repair a collapsed roof, using his strength and skill to rebuild something the war had broken. Watched Davis conduct an impromptu church service where Italian Catholics and Black American Baptists prayed together in languages they didn't share for an end to the killing. And he watched the villagers' faces as they revised their understanding of the world, watched fear give way to familiarity, watched propaganda collide with reality and shatter. These people had been told black soldiers were monsters, and instead they'd found men tired, scared, brave, kind. Human men who'd traveled across an ocean to fight for countries that would never fully accept them as equals. Lieutenant Morrison noticed it too, though he interpreted it through his own lens. "These people really like you boys," he said to Marcus one morning, as if this was surprising, as if kindness and competence were somehow unexpected. "Maybe we should use more Negro troops in these mountain villages." "Good for morale," Marcus didn't respond. Couldn't respond without saying things that would get him court-martialed, because Morrison couldn't understand that what was happening in Sommocolonia wasn't about utility or morale or military strategy. It was about human beings recognizing each other across barriers of language and propaganda and learned hatred. It was about fear being conquered by simple decency. On their last night in the village, before the orders came to move north toward the Po Valley, Signora Bianchi organized a gathering in the church. Nothing formal, nothing planned, just the villagers bringing what food they had, sharing it with the soldiers who'd liberated them. There was wine that had been hidden from the Germans, bread baked in ovens that had survived the shelling, cheese and olives, and the kind of simple food that tastes like luxury when you've been eating rations for months. Marcus sat with his squad and with these Italian families, and for a few hours the war receded. Not gone, never gone, but distant enough that you could pretend the world was normal. Willis taught Francesca more English words. Thomas traded stories with an old man who'd fought in the First War and understood the strange brotherhood of soldiers. Davis let everyone in sing an Amazing Grace, which needed no translation because grief and hope sound the same in every language. And Marcus sat next to Signora Bianchi, this woman who'd opened her door to a black soldier despite everything she'd been taught to fear, and they didn't talk much because they didn't need to. Sometimes understanding doesn't need words. "What will you do?" Marcus asked her finally. "After the war? Will you stay here?" "Where else would I go?" she said simply. "This is my home. My family is buried here. My memories are in these stones. The Germans came and tried to make us afraid in our own home, but they failed. And you and your black soldiers, you've reminded us that we don't have to believe the lies we're told. That is a gift. A strange gift from strangers, but a gift nonetheless." "We're moving out tomorrow," Marcus said, heading north. "The war's not over." "No," she agreed. "But this part is. This part where you saved us and we learned something true. That part is finished, and it will stay finished even after you are gone." She turned to look at him directly. "You ask what I will do after the war. I will tell this story. I will tell my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren. I will tell them that the Germans told us black soldiers were monsters, and instead they were the men who saved us. I will tell them that propaganda is a lie and kindness is the truth. This is what I will do." Marcus felt his throat tighten again. That same emotion he'd felt the first day when she'd opened her door and thanked him for being human. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for seeing us, for remembering." "Thank you," she countered, "for being worth remembering." The next morning, Company C packed up and moved out, heading north toward new battles, new villages, new opportunities to prove their humanity to people who'd been taught to deny it. Marcus took one last look at Sommocolonia, this small mountain village that probably wouldn't make it into any history books, that no general would mention in his memoirs, That was just one tiny point on a map of a war that had 10,000 such points. But as they marched away, and Marcus heard Francesca calling out goodbye, goodbye, thank you, in her English that Willis had taught her, he knew that this village mattered. Not for what had been won or lost in military terms, but for what had been learned. Humanity could survive propaganda. Kindness could defeat fear. And sometimes in the middle of the worst thing human beings can do to each other, there were these small moments of recognition where people saw past the lies to something true. That truth would have to be enough. It would have to sustain him through the battles ahead, through the racism that would greet him when he returned home, through all the years of fighting for equality in a country that couldn't decide if he was a hero or a second-class citizen. The memory of Signora Bianchi opening her door, the touch of a child's hand, the sound of villagers singing with black soldiers in a mountain church. These fragments against the ruins. These small victories against vast injustice. The war would go on. The 92nd Infantry Division would continue fighting through Italy, suffering casualties that were rarely reported, achieving victories that were seldom recognized, proving their valor to a nation that had already decided what they were worth. Marcus and his squad would survive some battles and lose brothers in others. They would liberate more villages and watch the Germans retreat, and finally, months later, they would hear that the war in Europe was over. And when Marcus came home to Philadelphia, to Clara, who'd waded into a country that had changed less than he'd hoped, he would carry Sommocolonia with him. Not as a talisman against bitterness, but as evidence that change was possible, that minds could be changed, that the work of proving your humanity was exhausting and shouldn't be necessary but was worth doing, because sometimes it worked. Years later, when the civil rights movement was fighting battles on American streets that felt as dangerous as anything in Italy, when Marcus was an old man telling stories to grandchildren who couldn't imagine a world where their grandfather had to prove he was human, he would think about Signora Bianchi and little Francesca. He would think about the moment when that door opened and fear gave way to recognition. He would think about how the simplest acts, kindness, courage, truth, could be revolutionary in a world built on hatred. And he would tell them, these grandchildren in their integrated schools with their integrated water fountains and their imperfectly better world, that the war was never really about territory or politics or even fascism versus democracy. It was always about this. The human need to see each other truly, beyond propaganda, beyond prejudice, beyond the comfortable lies that let us treat each other as less than human. The Germans had told the Italians that black soldiers were monsters. The Italians had believed it until the moment they didn't. And in that moment of revision, when belief collided with reality and reality won, something changed that couldn't be changed back. That was the victory Marcus carried home from Italy. Not medals or commendations or glory, but the knowledge that he had stood in a street in a village whose name he'd had to practice pronouncing, and he had been seen, truly seen, as a human being, as a soldier, as a man worthy of gratitude and respect and memory. It shouldn't have been extraordinary. In a just world, it would have been ordinary. But the world wasn't just, and so it was extraordinary, and so it mattered. The mountains of Italy didn't care what color you were. They killed you just the same. But the people of those mountains, they could learn. They could change. They could open a door despite their fear and discover that the monsters they'd been warned about were just men who'd come a long way to fight for freedom they didn't fully have themselves. And sometimes, in the arithmetic of war, where everything is calculated in loss, that learning, that change, that opening of doors, sometimes that was enough. Not victory, but hope. Not justice, but progress. Not the world as it should be, but the world as it might become if enough doors opened, if enough people looked past their fear to see what was actually standing there in the street. A soldier, an American, a man, a human being. The same thing he'd always been, from the moment he was born until the moment he stood on foreign soil and had to prove it one more time. Marcus Webb, Private First Class, 366th Infantry Regiment, 92nd Infantry Division. One of the Buffalo Soldiers who fought for a country that didn't fully claim them, who liberated people who'd been taught to fear them, who proved their humanity daily in a world that demanded constant proof. Heroes not because they were perfect, but because they were present, because they showed up, because they opened doors and crossed streets and extended hands despite every reason not to, because they fought fascism abroad while facing it at home and somehow maintained the capacity for kindness. That was the story. That was what mattered. That was what Signora Bianchi would tell her grandchildren, what Francesca would remember when she was old, what Marcus would carry home in his heart alongside the shrapnel scars and the memories of brothers who didn't make it. In a small mountain village in northern Italy, in February 1945, human beings learned to see each other, And in the middle of history's greatest war, that learning was its own kind of liberation. The war moved on. The soldiers moved on. The seasons changed and the mountains endured, and eventually the fighting stopped and Europe began the slow work of rebuilding. But in Sommocolonia, in memories and stories passed down through generations, there remained the image of black American soldiers walking into the square at dawn. Not monsters, not propaganda, just men who'd come to help, who'd proven their humanity through simple acts of decency, who'd changed minds by being present and kind and brave. It wasn't enough to fix the world, but it was something. And sometimes the darkness seems complete and justice feels impossible and the work of being human is exhausting beyond measure. Something is enough to keep going. Marcus Webb knew that truth. Signora Bianchi knew it. And now in this story, you know it too. The liberation of Italy wasn't just about territory. It was about people recognizing people. And in that recognition, however brief, however hard-won, there was a glimmer of the world that could be, should be, must be, if we're to call ourselves human at all.